Hello, I'm Darine Abougaida. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your look at the world of business and economics. This week, the climate emergency, the price of going green, and why it doesn't need to cost the earth. So what is the world waiting for? Also this week, New Zealand, an economic testbed for inflation in the 90s. Has the world's central banks watching closely for its next experiment? This time, it's targeting surging house prices. Iraq has no gold deposits, yet it's become one of the country's top exports. Billions exported to Turkey. We find out why. Well, as the nation responsible for the biggest share of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere today, President Biden has pledged more money and made new commitments to fight climate change. After his predecessor walked away from commitments to reduce harmful emissions that threaten to wreak havoc to global weather patterns, rising sea levels, and displacing people, Washington is making climate change a priority. And it wants the number 1 and number 3 big emitters, China and India, to contribute more to the fight. Well, the pandemic has proven where there's a will, there's a way, and money is no object. In fact, the global cost of a transition to renewable energy by 2050 would be $73 trillion. That's according to Stanford University, which researchers believe could be recovered over a period of 7 years. And there's added benefits. The shift to a zero-carbon global economy would create 28.6 million more full-time jobs than if nations continue their current reliance on fossil fuels. Well, now, if the United States wants to make the transition to renewables over the next 9 years, it could. The cost would be $4.5 trillion, or a little more than the cost of 2 wars in Afghanistan. That number comes from energy consultants Wood Mackenzie, but even they acknowledge that would not be feasible because of social and political issues. Well, one of the biggest factors is what to do with businesses that emit and contribute to climate change. They would need time to transition. Otherwise, the global financial system that includes banks, pensions, and insurance could be sitting on losses of $20 trillion. But there is a mechanism that penalizes big polluters by making them buy credits to offset their emissions. It's called carbon trading. So you may have heard of deals like this, where Elon Musk's Tesla sells carbon credits, generating a revenue of $1.58 billion in 2020. And this year, Volkswagen in China bought credits from the maker of electric cars. And then there are oil companies like BP that are keen to dump assets to reduce their carbon footprint. It sold its Alaska oil fields to a little-known privately held company called Hilcorp for $5.6 billion. The problem is the world doesn't see a drop in emissions. They still exist. But a publicly traded company with shareholders and activists has now offloaded verifiable emissions to a company that has little incentive to declare them. So this is what we're going to do. We'll pick up on carbon trading right after this report from Kristen Salumi in New York. That's where authorities are promising to have 70% of their electricity come from renewable sources by 2030. It's one of the most ambitious clean energy plans in the country.
In the heart of New York sits the legendary Big Alice, once the world's largest electric generating unit. Its owner, Rise Light and Power, now wants to make it the cleanest, with plans to build the largest battery facility in the country right here in 2 years, a storage facility for renewable energy.
What are the challenges that you face to meet this deadline in terms of...
CEO Clint Plummer acknowledges it won't be easy.
Our challenge is New York's challenge, and it's also the country's challenge and the world's challenge, is how do we transition from a economy, a city that's run primarily on fossil fuels for as long as we've had electricity, to one that's focusing on now running on clean energy infrastructure.
That's how you make electricity. You take a large electromagnet and you spin it.
They're taking their dirtiest carbon-spewing oil and gas-fired generators offline to make way for the batteries. They'll also need transmission lines to tie into wind and solar farms outside the city. But currently, renewables make up just 2% of downstate energy.
New York is attempting to wean itself off of fossil fuels. At the same time, it's taking another major source of carbon-free electricity offline, the Indian Point nuclear power plant. In 2019, this facility alone was responsible for 13% of the state's power.
While environmentalists long pushed for its closure, some are now arguing nuclear power is currently the only carbon-free technology able to replace fossil fuels. They point out the state is building more natural gas facilities to make up the difference.
If you look at the examples of Germany and Vermont and California, there are small studies that have shown that when you get rid of nuclear, in general, air pollution and carbon emissions actually increase.
Still, others say the switch to renewables has to start happening for New York Power to be carbon-free by 2040.
Right now, battery technology, wind technology, solar technology, there's tremendous effort underway to make those technologies less expensive, more reliable, and where possible, smaller.
All agree the need to keep the lights on and eliminate fossil fuels mean there must be change on the horizon. Kristen Salumi, Al Jazeera, New York.
So that's just one story of the energy transition. And as we said earlier, many companies are using carbon credits to aid their transition to renewables. But are they fit for purpose? Well, my next guest is Nicolette Bartlett, who's the Global Director of Climate Change at Environment Monitoring Advisory, CDP. Thanks for speaking to us on Counting the Cost. Your latest research finds that half of the world's biggest 500 companies are indeed factoring carbon accounting in their business plans. But let's just look at the cup half empty for a moment. At this stage in our climate emergency, it's not really good enough, is it?
No, indeed. I mean, we have seen an 80% jump in the last 5 years of companies internalizing carbon costs and those driving different investment decisions. But we need to see a much higher proportion of them doing so, as you've just articulated. Carbon pricing ultimately places a monetary value on carbon itself. And whether it's through regulation or whether companies do it themselves, the aim is to trigger a change in investment decisions. And of course, there's a direct link between companies doing this and the regulation in the market. We've also seen that it does drive change when it's used. So it goes hand in hand with some of the emission reduction activities that companies are doing. So we see a direct correlation. Those companies that use the price and those companies that are setting science-based targets, investing in renewable energy, etc., directly correlated. At the same time, however, it's interesting to see, this year we've seen a big spike in, for example, the European emission trading scheme in terms of prices. The median company, the median price that we see companies reporting to us that they use internally is about $28. Now, this is below where the EU ETS spiked to this year. So it seems to me that not only more companies need to do it, but the prices that they use need to increase.
Right. So let me ask you this. The cost of renewables are falling, and now is the time to push ahead and leave straggling companies behind. Anything else other than that will just look like socializing their failures, won't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And of course, it's not just about renewables. And it's not just about carbon pricing regulation per se. There are a myriad of regulation signals that are coming down the market fast in many countries, almost all countries right now, whether it be targets, whether it be standards, whether it be incentives, whether it be investment patterns changing. These are changing the way in which we need to invest in the future and the assets we make in the future. We've seen a continuous increase in carbon pricing itself regulation over the last many years. Where about 64 jurisdictions have a carbon price right now, whether at a state or provincial level or at a national level. And of course, China announced that it will be launching an emissions trading system in 2021. But we need this quicker and we need it faster. And in terms of carbon pricing itself, it is incredibly helpful for sectors such as cement and steel, where renewables and clean energy will not be the only solution to the technology challenges they have. You also have this announcement by the EU that it plans to have a border tax adjustment, which means that the cost of carbon will be included in the cost of those products if they're brought in from outside of the European Union. And I think this is also really interesting and something that companies need to watch out for.
Look, we were mentioning BP earlier on, and BP has sold its Alaskan oil business. The new buyer is a private company. So this is good for BP, but those emissions still exist. Who's actually monitoring the private buyer?
Well, this is a really interesting question. And of course, we may see more of this as a trend in the future. We see that with a significant number of fossil fuel assets right now going into private hands and private equity. I think what we're seeing is we obviously need regulation and we need monitoring. Now, we have increased scrutiny on those companies who are listed, and we need to now start shine the spotlight on the companies that are not listed. And regulation is vital, of course, but all of the monitoring that needs to happen by NGOs, by civil society, by the media, and particularly by the investment community themselves. We work with over nearly 600 investors that have about 110 trillion in assets. And over the last 20 years, we've been working with them to get companies to measure and manage these type of emissions.
Right, and while many banks, apologies, but I mean, look at banks for a moment. So while they talk about net zero targets, that hasn't really stopped them from continuing to finance coal, oil, as well as gas ventures.
Absolutely. We have another piece of analysis coming out in about a week's time, which really looks at what banks are disclosing to us. And while you see a significant number of banks saying they're aligning their own internal practices and their investment and lending decisions with the Paris Agreement or with a below 2-degree world, this is not yet translated into a shift in their portfolios. We need to see that, and we need to see it quickly. I think not enough focus has been put on the banking community in this space. So we have the momentum now, we have the scrutiny, and I think civil society and other actors, that's where they need to be focused. The financing of these things needs to stop, and banks play a major role in that.
Okay, Nicolette Bartlett, thank you so much for speaking to us from London.
Thank you very much.
Now, before we leave this topic, one more report for you. And it's important on so many levels because China is the world's biggest emitter of greenhouse gases. President Xi Jinping has pledged to fight climate change, but the government continues to build new coal plants, one of the leading sources of carbon emissions. Katrina Yu reports from Jiaojing in Jiangxi province.
Plumes of toxic smoke leaking from power plants and factories is a common sight in Shanxi. The northwestern province has for decades powered China's economic growth, primarily by burning coal. It's contributed to the nation becoming the world's top polluter, responsible for roughly 1/3 of global carbon emissions. The coal industry employs most of the people who live here.
Pollution? It's been polluting for decades. If they shut down all the factories, what are we going to do? Everyone works for the factories.
Last year, this region produced about 1.1 billion tons of coal.
China's reliance on burning coal as its main source of energy is its biggest obstacle to lowering carbon emissions. The government is struggling to find ways to curb its use of coal without affecting jobs or harming economic growth.
Pollution caused by burning fossil fuels regularly shrouds the capital in heavy smog. Beijing has pledged to peak carbon emissions by 2030 and eliminate them altogether by 2060. But it's yet to detail how exactly it plans to achieve this.
It's not only about commitment, it's all about what we actually do, right? In the next 5 years, we expect China can implement more concrete policies and to give us a more clear roadmap how they're going to achieve these two carbon targets.
Increasing the use of renewable energy sources is crucial. China is already the world's largest producer of wind and solar power. It's also the biggest market for electric vehicles. The government has tightened regulations to pressure car makers into transitioning away from gas. But many say that's not enough. U.S. climate envoy John Kerry was in Shanghai trying to convince authorities to do more.
For a big country with 1.4 billion people, these goals are not easily delivered. Some countries are asking China to do more on climate change. I'm afraid this is not very realistic.
Researchers say China must close down more than 500 coal-fired power plants in the next decade to meet its climate pledges. But it continues to approve new ones at a faster rate than anywhere else in the world. The Shanxi government is planning to close down some older factories here and build what it says are greener, more efficient coal facilities. For some parts of China at least, it seems the road to clean energy will be long and slow. Katrina Yu, Al Jazeera, Shanxi Province, China.
Now, think New Zealand. What comes to mind? The All Blacks rugby team, its Maori culture, and its picturesque landscape. And yes, its exceptional handling of the pandemic. but it's also been known as a leader in the field of economics. Back in 1989, New Zealand's central bank was the first to commit to a specific target for consumer price inflation, then the biggest threat to the world economy. At the time, there was great opposition to the idea, but inflation fell from 8% to 2% over 2 years. And inflation targets were adopted by most central banks to tame runaway prices. So it wouldn't surprise you that the Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, has tasked the central bank to limit the rise of house prices. An important issue globally when you consider, despite the pandemic, house prices have soared. In New Zealand, the average house price increased by 24.3% to 826,000 New Zealand dollars in March 2021, a record high for the country. Now, this is such an important issue globally on so many levels. So let's get some analysis from Auckland. We're joined by Bernie Smith, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Monte Housing Trust. Thanks so much for speaking to us on Counting the Costs. The Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, was elected on the promise of housing, affordable housing. How's that going?
It's not been going very well for the government at all. In fact, their 4 years in term so far, prices have rapidly increased to the extent that it's actually creating homelessness and costing the government $1 million a day just in emergency and transitional housing.
So how did it get to the point where there's a chronic housing shortage?
Well, this present government would suggest that it was the previous national government, but they know as well as we know on the ground that it's been decades in the making, and both governments, the right and the left, have had a real desire to have a market-driven economy. Because it means a healthy economy. They haven't been building the houses at the level that they did in the 50s and 60s. You know, the population has gone from 2 million to 5 million. And we're just in this situation now that seems impossible to turn around, but I'm sure we will at some stage.
So is it possible to pinpoint one reason or several reasons behind the house price rises? Is it speculation, the central banks printing money, building regulations, high immigrations? What is it? Or is it a combination of all of those?
It's a combination of all of those. Speculators, for instance, if they've got $1 million in the bank, they might gain about 0.5% interest, which is a very little return. They could buy a house for $1 million and flick it in a couple of years. In some cases, they can flip it in months and make hundreds of thousands. Equally, they're taking advantage of the lack of supply of housing, and of course the government is assisting low-income families with income-related rent. So the speculation has continued. The central bank, as much as the government has desired to hinder it in the sense of stopping or slowing down the housing market, our central bank is supposed to be totally independent, and its main driver is to ensure that the economy stays healthy. So really the government has no sway on what it does. It can give advice, but it can't instruct.
What happened to the government $2 billion plan to build more housing, Kiwi Build?
Kiwi Build became the laughing stock of New Zealand, really, because Kiwi Build was trumpeted as part of their election campaign to build 100,000 houses per year. So that over 10 years, so 10,000 a year. The first year they built about 300, and of those 300, they were barely able to sell half of those. They were building them in the wrong locations. The price benchmarks were incorrect. So they've taken that target away totally. And now instead of having inspirational policies, as they called the Kiwi Build, they've got what they call foundational policies. So in other words, we're not going to set any targets. We're in this for the long haul. And only now are they starting to get a little bit of traction on the Kiwi Build development. But we're talking about 1,000 or 2,000. We're not talking about tens of thousands at this point.
Right. And do you think that it would be possible for the central bank to control house prices inflation?
There's no doubt that the central bank could control if they so chose. But the difficulty is they need to manage the economy as a whole, and they don't see it, as I understand it, as their key responsibility. It's really the government's responsibility by ensuring that the government pulls all the levers it possibly can to ensure that housing that is a right to every individual in this country and many countries across the world, that everyone has an opportunity, whether it's rental or whether it's purchase. And the government's just not doing it because they're becoming more central, and I believe they're more focused on being re-elected in a couple of years than what they are in the sense of being focused on the needs of families that are falling into homelessness through no fault of their own.
Bernie Smith, the Chief Executive Officer of the Monte, Cecilia Housing Trust, thank you so much for speaking to us from Auckland.
No worries at all. Thank you.
And finally, gold has become one of Iraq's top exports, despite there being no gold deposits in the country. In 2020, Iraq exported nearly $8 billion worth to Turkey alone. So, what's the secret? Osama bin Javed reports from Baghdad.
In an old Baghdad workshop, the same melting pot has been used for decades. Najah Abdul Amir converts old gold into 21-carat bars. In the chemical process, each element is carefully measured and added according to the weight. He's been doing it for years, but business is not what it was before the 2003 US invasion. Now, with rising demand for newer and finer designs, most of his orders go to Turkey or Gulf states. For local goldsmiths, it's difficult to compete with modern machinery, cheap electricity and labor.
We hope the government supports us with new machines. We want support for the workshops, and we demand to stop exporting gold.
Gold is now among Iraq's top 3 exports after oil. The trade with Turkey alone has reached nearly $8 billion in 2020 from $2.5 billion in 2019. Iraq doesn't produce gold, but imports it from other countries, and gold traders export it for processing into jewelry.
The local gold industry has died, not just gold but all local industries. There is a lack of electricity. Iraq is not attractive for investment and not business friendly. So Iraqi traders and businessmen go to Turkey and other countries because it is better quality and cheaper.
So how much gold goes in and out of Iraq? Apparently, there's no clear data. We asked the Ministry of Trade, who directed us to the Ministry of Finance, who told us to ask the central bank, which in turn said that data must be kept by the Ministry of Planning.
In fact, this issue of how much is imported is not our job. We only plan for the quality and legal imports. The Organization for Quality and Standards monitors goldsmiths all over Iraq. Also, we have offices at border crossings and airports to guarantee quality and reduce smuggling.
Deep-rooted corruption and a weak economy makes it easier for black market operators to move things across borders. Diplomatic sources told Al Jazeera that due to lax security at crossings and lawlessness, there is gold being smuggled from neighboring countries. And Iraq's economic uncertainty leads to increased local demand despite the current coronavirus pandemic. This bar of gold costs about $55,000 in today's market. Because of Iraq's security, many families are investing in precious metals rather than keeping their money in dollars or Iraqi dinars. From glittering religious sites to important social occasions, Iraqis have had a centuries-old relationship with gold. And as the precious commodity is now a major economic entity, they want the government to ensure it adds to the economy rather than taking away from it. Osama bin Javed, Al Jazeera, Baghdad.
And that's our show for this week, but there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has entire episodes for you to catch up on. I'm Darine Abougeda. You've been watching Counting the Cost. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.